Today we review The Killing Death. Welcome to Soup Reviews. What's your favorite scary movie? Today we review 2008's The Killing Death, as requested by Dark Forest Film on Twitter. Groovy. The Killing Death, written and directed by Ian Russell, starring Jeremy Dangerfield, Jeff Trubiak, and Neil Raymer. The Killing Death is the story of two detectives tracking down a serial killer who's just trying to make a pizza. The Killing Death is more of a horror comedy whodunit, except you know at the very beginning who had actually done it. And on top of that, the comedy is akin to a turkey that's been placed in the oven at 475 degrees for about 6 days. Oh, that's some dry comedy. This film begins with the lady getting home and the killer is in her apartment. Cut to two detectives driving in a car while the credits roll. We are then introduced to the old detective, Frank, and the new detective, Jimmy, when they arrive at the crime scene, which starts Act 1, starting off on the right foot, because the victim's right foot is missing. And then, of course, we see cops eating donuts. Cut to a couple on the couch watching a cheesy movie. The dude needs to go into work. Well, he gets called in, supposedly, and he grabs a knife. So we suspect that he is the killer. And this starts Act 2, Keep an Open Mind. So we're now introduced to a blind professor who is answering some students' questions. And then he starts walking down the hallway while being stalked by who we assume is the killer. His collar is all screwed up, which kind of adds to the fact that he's blind, and it's kind of funny. Now, the professor he's in a basement or something as he continues walking down this hallway, but he doesn't really have any idea where he's going. The professor can tell that he's being stalked, so he starts running, and he starts running into things, and eventually gets killed, and his head gets cut open, and his brain gets extracted. And it's at this point that when the detectives are investigating this murder that we see just how incompetent they really are. So, to discuss this scene a little bit, there's a lot of humorous conversations going on between Frank and the coroner, but also primarily between Jimmy, who has an argument with the janitor. And so the janitor admits to cleaning up all the blood, and he says to Jimmy, "Evidence to you, to me, it's just another mess." And they kind of go on from there, where the janitor ends up ranting about how he was not taught in school just how much blood is involved in spontaneous combustion, and it's hilarious. So then we start Act 3, Eyes on the Prize. There starts off with a lady sitting on the couch eating ice cream, and there's a knock at the door, and it's Phil, the person we assume is the killer. And he's delivering a pizza, but she didn't order a pizza, so he asks to use the phone. He dials in 6 numbers and says it's busy. So he sits down and they start talking, and he starts creeping and then uses an ice cream scoop to take out her eyes. And he says, quote, "Geez, these won't come out. What did you do? Glue them in?" Unquote. We then get a conversation between Frank and Jimmy, where Frank proves himself to be a grizzled, aged detective, and his dialogue is really funny. And then Jimmy kind of plays the young novice detective, and they have this conversation while they're eating, and it's just pretty excellent. So this begins Act 4, Freshly Squeezed Colon Juice. So Phil does the same pizza trick with an old friend. So he goes into this guy's apartment, and there is a wall covered with pages from porn magazines. And Phil just stops and looks at it and goes, "Wow, it really looks like you redecorated." And this guy calls his collection photo art. So we are treated to some funny dialogue, and then we find out that apparently Phil and Bruce had some sort of fling, and so now they get back together, and Phil has Bruce bent over the couch, and he takes a power drill and shoves it up Bruce's butt. And this kills Bruce, and then Phil proceeds to juice his colon. Cut to. So while Jimmy and Frank were investigating the dead professor who had his brain scooped out, they find some Egyptian hieroglyphics. So they take it to a professor of Egyptology, and they start investigating him and questioning him as to what these hieroglyphics would mean. Here, we spend like a full 60 seconds watching this professor trying to put on a rubber glove, and then ultimately they end up arresting him. Cut to. So then Phil gets home, his girlfriend teases him, and then we're treated to a montage of ridiculous innuendos, and apparently he couldn't perform. Cut to. Act 5, You Stole My Heart. So Jimmy and Frank are driving down the street with the professor in the back of the cop car, and the professor is trying to explain why it's so ridiculous that they would arrest him, and he just happens to say, for all you know, that hobo on the street did it. And Frank says, did you hear that, Jimmy? I think he just gave us his accomplice. And Frank jumps out of the car and arrests the hobo, throws him in the back of the car, and then we're treated to about a minute of the gassy hobo just farting. Cut to. So Phil uses his pizza trick again to go to an ex's house, and while they're talking, she's kind of prodding at him for not being able to perform, and they argue. She tries to kick him out, and then he literally punches her heart out of her chest. Cut to. The detectives now investigating Bruce's crime scene. Morty, the coroner, believes that he died from explosive diarrhea. Frank arrests Morty because he thinks that he is also one of the professor's accomplices. Slit Throat 2. Act 6, The Sound of One Hand Clapping. So back in the cop car, Frank says, how do you explain Morty being at every crime scene? And Jimmy says, he's the coroner. Cut to. Phil killing a lady with a sex toy, and then he cuts off her hand. Now the detectives by chance just happen upon this crime scene, and Jimmy notices that the crime scene is fresh. And Frank says, you seem to have a lot of information for someone who's innocent. And Jimmy notices that there's a pizza box and says, I think we found our killer. And Frank proceeds to start handcuffing himself and saying, how did I ever think I'd get away with it? Cut to Phil at the pizza shop, and his boss is just confirming with him that it's going to be okay if he closes up on his own. Act 7, The End is Nigh. Warning, soup spoils. Phil starts putting all those body parts into a pizza box. Jimmy and Frank get to the pizzeria and argue about who is going to go in first. Phil gets home and his girlfriend is asleep on the couch. Jimmy and Frank, inside the pizzeria, find Phil's address and a picture of him and decide that they're going to go to his place. So Phil used those body parts to make a really gross-looking pizza, and he's going to try to feed it to his blindfolded girlfriend. And when the detectives bust in, all of a sudden, there is a Scooby-Doo-like chase scene where they're in the hallway, and they're going through all these doors, coming out different doors, and it's just over-the-top ridiculous, especially for any movie ever. So the detectives catch Phil. Jimmy handcuffs himself to Phil. They're at the top of the building, and Phil jumps off the building. So everybody thinks that Jimmy died with him, but it turns out Jimmy was able to hang on to the building, and Phil's hand just came right off. And then we get a partial credit scene where Phil's girlfriend is about to eat the gross body part pizza. And then, if you watch to the end of the credits, the creator thanks you for enduring. This movie has no qualms about what it is. It markets itself as a no-budget movie, and it was probably made by just a group of friends who were able to get together and knock this thing out. For what it is, this movie is awesome. It's hilarious. It's pretty well paced. It's only about an hour long, and on top of that, Even though there's some negatives, the acting's not that great, but it's not terrible. And then the lighting is terrible all the time. But this movie was a lot of fun, and so that's why I'm gonna give it a C+ on the Super scale. Special thanks to Shakefist for letting me use their music. Thanks, guys. You're gonna regret it.